Gary Romano, thank you so much for joining me today on Coffee Conversations, today to discuss succession planning. So, Gary, you are with
Civitas, you
Civitas? How
got
do
it.
we say it? Okay,
Civitas
Civitas
strategies.
Strategies. And you are also a well-published author of a series of books, including Small But Mighty, a book for consultants specifically, and how consultants can change the world. You are a really awesome guy, and you've been kind enough to come on here and not only give me some tips on what I can do with my own consulting practice, but to talk to us today about succession planning. And I can't thank you enough for the time you're giving us.
I'm glad to
Um,
be here.
and have you been running Civitas for how long? What are we talking about?
It's been 11 years.
Excellent.
11 years of doing this work and even longer consulting in the space.
Okay.
So that goes back to 2005.
All
Yeah.
right. Great. Well, and I think the nonprofit sector, there are certain names that get floated around for people who are doing good in the work, and yours is one of those. So I feel really special to have you today. Tell me a little bit about the different services that Civitas offers.
Absolutely. So we're a management consultancy. We focus on mission-driven organizations. So they've got to be serving the public good. They also need to, in some way, be improving the lives of vulnerable children and families. So we only work with organizations that are doing that as well.
Mhm.
They could be for-profit or nonprofit. And we offer strategic planning services. We have our own system, which is my next book, which is Finding Your North Star,
Okay.
um, which has been a system that I've developed over the past 30 plus years of doing planning work professionally. We also do coaching, we do capacity building, so developing systems for organizations so they can be more efficient and effective. We also do recruiting. We have our own little, that was my second book, which is a system that we offer freely on our website of recruiting, and we also do HR system development. And we also do program evaluation. And in fact, that work actually kind of grew so large. 4 years ago, we spun it out into its own separate LLC. So that is Luminary Evaluation Group. And they do a number of different multi-year and single-year evaluations. Though we work with larger nonprofit organizations like Kellogg and Casey, our real focus day to day is on small to mid-sized organizations. So really trying to bring affordable, effective management consulting to a group of organizations that just have not been able to afford it and access it in the past.
Yeah. And don't think that it is really a viable option for them. It's one of the things that I try to hit on very often with my clients, as well as other small nonprofits, that all of these things that seem so lofty, these ideas and almost academic sort of conversations about how to run your nonprofit in the best way can be yours, and they are reachable. And lean recruitment is free on your website and a resource that they can immediately utilize. So that's every
Absolutely.
time I talk to you, I feel like I learn a little bit more about what you're doing, what and more what. It's amazing. So one of the services that you provide is with strategic planning, and that, of course, includes succession planning. So the succession leadership planning. So talk to me about what succession planning is in general.
So, I think it's a lot of things to a lot of people. It reminds me a bit like strategic planning, right? And one of the things you'll see in our system and in the book is we define it. In our system for succession planning, leadership legacy, we do the same thing, right? And I think the challenge is that so many times people say it has to be this. What I have found over the years is that what's most important is to define it as being prepared for a planned or unplanned transition.
Mm-hmm.
Ideally, for most nonprofits, you're going to be talking about your ED or CEO position. It can be other important positions as
Mm-hmm.
well. And really, you're doing that because this is about the effective use of resources, right? So you want to figure out ahead of time, how can we be ready for those transitions so we don't lose time and money,
Mm-hmm.
so that we can use a transition as an opportunity maybe to, fill the position in a different way in the future and use that as a natural opportunity and point for transition. But I think, sometimes we have it as so narrowly defined as it's about who's going to replace the CEO and that's it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's actually an opportunity for completely re-envisioning your mission, like how you're going to achieve your mission. And so some component of that is leadership, but could be so much bigger. So that's exciting. What are some of the considerations that you will undertake, or a nonprofit will undertake during this sort of planning?
So I think first and foremost, right, you want to make sure that you're not viewing it as a binary system, right?
Mm-hmm,
So just like I was saying, it's not just about who replaces the CEO, who doesn't replace the CEO, who is going to be in line to be ED or who isn't,
mm-hmm,
right? But really, again, if we come back to this idea that it's being prepared for a planned or unplanned transition, right now what we're talking about is really it's about risk mitigation.
okay.
It's about how you mitigate your risks. And I think this reframing is so important because now we're not talking about what usually happens with succession planning, right? Which is you say, Gary, I'm like the ED, there's 10 of us. I don't even know how I'm going to do this, how I'm going to find a successor. I can't do succession planning. It's too much work. Therefore, I'm just not going to do it at all, right? Two, if it's about risk mitigation, what are the small steps you can take that begin to mitigate that risk?
Mm-hmm,
Even
mm-hmm,
if you never get to the big step of finding that successor for
mm-hmm,
you, have you at least reduced the risk of an unprepared or a planned transition,
mm-hmm.
right? Which is ultimately the goal.
Yeah, it makes it seem more manageable. It's like bite-sized pieces.
Mhm.
And there are so many things that the executive director or the CEO can do that will lower that risk without finding the person.
That's exactly right.
So what are some of those things? I mean, I can immediately think of, wanting to reduce their workload so that it's not this huge long job description that involves them doing everything and it's all up here, and there's some things like that. So talk to me about
Yeah,
what
yeah,
that
yeah.
looks like.
So in leadership legacy, we have three phases, right? The
Okay.
first phase is that most basic risk reduction, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what we always recommend is just three simple things, right? So one is first and foremost, do you have an emergency procedure,
Yeah,
right?
that's good.
So many nonprofits don't, and especially, knowing Ginny, you work with a lot of organizations in the South, right? We do a lot of work, for example, in Florida and Texas. We can have a whole conversation about the environment, but the reality is the number of superstorms is up. And we've had a number of clients who have been in a pickle when they've had superstorms. I literally had one client at one point call me up and say, I've told the board that if, because we may get hit pretty hard, if I can't reach anyone for a few days, you're in charge. And I was like, no, I'm the client. I mean, you're the client. I'm the
Right.
consultant. I am not in charge of your organization.
Yeah.
But there was no plan. Another
Yeah.
organization we worked with where they did that procedure, and I always recommend, do a live fire exercise, right? Try it. Can you
Yeah.
execute it? And they realized key people were not on the bank signature card, right?
Yeah.
So they would not be able to access the bank records if somebody was stuck. And this is not, again, it's important to think of it not just in terms of, as we often say, if I get hit by a car tomorrow, but it
Yeah.
could be stuff like, a CEO who, because of a storm got isolated in the Caribbean on a
Sure.
vacation, right? And you can't
Yep.
get in touch with them.
Mm-hmm.
So number one is, do you have that emergency procedure? Number two, have you done what we call knowledge capture? And there's a lot of ways to do it. You can find this on our website. We talk about it very
That's
openly.
great.
But basically, it's a process for getting all those things that you're doing, which is so important because so many times, right? Things like the passwords. What am I supposed to do next week? What are the things I do every month? What are the specialized things I need to get done? So
Yep.
that if I'm not here tomorrow, somebody can get it and not miss a beat.
Excellent.
By the way, for CEOs and EDs, this is also a nice way of subtly sharing with your board, hey, did you know all the things I do? Right?
Yeah.
So it
Excellent point.
becomes it becomes a nice double
Yeah.
duty, right? But this becomes, again, it reduces risk. So if something
Mm-hmm.
happens to Jenny and she's not in tomorrow, people know where to
Take
go
everything
for
here.
information, right? You've already done that
Mm-hmm.
knowledge transfer and it's in a simple way.
Mm-hmm.
The final thing that we recommend is committing to how you're going to do a search. And it seems so simple, but I know of so many organizations where they don't commit to it ahead of time, they get stuck. We do searches, as you mentioned earlier, and we had a client a couple of years ago who the ED had said they were going to be leaving. They gave them 6 months notice, which is more than ample time. They came to us to start the search. 1 month before the CEO was leaving. And I was like, what happened? And they said, well, basically for 5 months, board's a volunteer board. They don't meet every week. They were debating, how should we do a search? Should we not do a search? Should it be internal
Fear.
only? Should it be external? And it seems so silly, but people get so caught up.
Oh, yes.
And so just even that third thing of saying, we're going to search or we're not going to search,
Mm-hmm.
right? Or we're going to use a professional or we're not.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Having that ready in case of emergency to break glass and just pull that out and use it. Those three things reduce your risk greatly. And
Mm-hmm.
and for all of you out there who are saying, I don't have time for succession planning, you can make time for those things. You have to make time for those things,
Those
right?
should be in place no matter what. Like
That's
we just,
right.
no matter what. Yeah.
That's right. But they're typically not. I would say upwards of 85, 90% of nonprofits, even large ones, don't have all
Yes.
three things in place.
No, I would agree with you. In fact, when you were talking about the crisis planning, that's one of my big things that I do with my clients because I had to learn it the hard way. When I was an executive director, we had a fire in our building, and suddenly I was like, "Well, what do we do when we can't access our things and our client files and all and our each other, and we have no space?" So I had to learn it the hard way, and I don't want to see other clients getting into that pickle. So it's but most people say it's not going to happen to me, right? That's always what we say.
Well, I think there's a lot of issues with it, right? Because we say there are other bigger things and we get overwhelmed, right? So
Mm-hmm.
we always do
Mm-hmm.
goal-based
Mm-hmm.
work when it comes to succession planning. We always say, like, Jenny, don't focus on the three things. Focus on what's the next thing. Emergency
Yeah.
procedure in place.
Mm-hmm.
Focus on that till it's
Let's go
done.
there. Then we'll go to the
Knowledge
next.
capture. Focus on that until it's done. Because you're not only getting these things done and reducing your risk, you're also then can celebrate those victories and get excited about it.
Great.
Because otherwise, it does become daunting, it becomes overwhelming. And there's also, as you pointed out, technically in our system, it really starts with what I call the conversation, which is having typically the ED and the board chair are out of sync.
Yeah.
One or the other wants succession planning. And it gets hard to broach the conversation because, you get into issues of mortality, right? I had a conversation where I was sent in by a large foundation to talk to one of their grantees years ago about succession planning, older gentleman, great person, wonderful person. I said, so what happens to all of this when you're gone? When you're not here working this position anymore? How do we make sure the legacy continues? And he said, I don't plan to ever leave the job. And I was like, well, but at some point you're likely to die. To which he said, I don't plan on dying. And that, of course, makes it a much harder
Wow.
conversation. But
Yeah.
I appreciated the transparency and the honesty because
That he
many of the
wasn't
times when
willing.
you talk about transitions, that's what happens, right?
Yeah.
Especially if it's a founder. You get into questions of mortality, you get into a little defensiveness of,
Yeah. Only I have this vision and could do it right.
that's
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
But it's nice to be able to start with some of these other things I mentioned because they become easier, right?
Mm-hmm.
It
Mm-hmm.
becomes more palatable. It isn't about, you know, let's find the younger Ginny to take her job, right? Because
Right.
sometimes people feel that way versus let's just reduce risk. What do you do? Let's write it down. Let's get an emergency procedure in place. Let's know what we do if you are not here, how we're going to proceed.
Yeah. That makes perfect sense. And it replaces that whole we're going to find somebody to replace you. Love it. That's a really great approach that you have learned well from doing it with multiple clients who think they are not going to die, which is an
Ever. Yeah.
interesting, it could be an entire different show. That's a really interesting, I would like to know their process and what they're,
I know.
what they've got going on.
We'll call
Um,
that plan B from here on out.
there you go. And we could even suggest that, like, oh, that could be plan B. Let's
Yeah,
move
there
on
you
to
go.
these other discussions. Um, so when you talk about using a professional, because you mentioned using a professional for this kind of risk reduction approach, what does that look like? How does the consultant facilitate that? How do how does Civitas go in and help facilitate discussions around risk reduction and succession planning?
And I think, I mean, it's a great question. And I think how it's facilitated depends greatly on the consultant you're using. And that goes back to the definitional approach, right? So what I would say, number one is, make sure they have a system, right? Because you want them following a system. You want something that can be replicated, that isn't, this is their first time, or somehow you're going to end up at an endpoint,
Mhm,
right? So number one, they should have a pathway for you. And
mhm.
again, it should be an incremental pathway. So if for any reason let's say there's a 100-year pandemic and you have to shut down, you at least got part of the way. And you can say we didn't get everything done. It wasn't, again, a binary system where we didn't complete it, so now it's nothing, versus, well, we got to the first 3 milestones, so we've reduced some risk, or 4 milestones. So
Gotcha.
make sure it's something that can be done that way, because then they can help you along the way with reducing your risk in a way that could be replicated and will work, right? The other way that they can help you, ways in addition to bringing a system, is hopefully helping you articulate what you want. We have a maxim at Civitas Strategies where we say that we plan with clients and not for clients. Too many times, it is about the consultant saying, okay, Jenny, you fill out this form and then I give you your succession plan. It doesn't work that way, right?
Yeah, it's going to go into a file cabinet anyway, and it
That's
won't be
right.
helpful in any way to
That's
anyone.
right. That's right. You have organizational culture, you have emotions, you have real people, you have
Mhm,
considerations about junior staff. There's so much that goes into this. So you need somebody who can help you sort through that. And so
mhm.
a good consultant can help you do that. But finally, at the end of the day, part of it is, you always talk about the reasons why you hire a consultant, right? And one of the reasons is staff augmentation, right? So part of it is, we talked about, you don't always have the time.
Yeah,
So it can be a great opportunity to make an investment, leverage your resources with somebody who's going to keep you accountable and get the parts done that you just never have time, versus you plod along waiting for the catastrophe.
yeah. Yeah, and knowing that that just needs to get done, and tomorrow it'll get done, and maybe next week it'll get done, and it just keeps being on that to-do list, but
That's
never
right.
gets crossed through. I remember that lifestyle very, very well. That is a tough, that to-do list just keeps on growing. It's
Yeah,
one of the reasons why I got into the consulting business, so I could help my executive directors prioritize and determine when it's time to hire that consultant like Civitas to help them come in and help them with those items.
that's absolutely right.
Do
Absolutely
you
right.
do any succession planning discussions around board succession? That's something I talk with my clients a lot about with strategic planning is, part in recruitment, board recruitment, is thinking about this pipeline of board members and what it needs to look like, especially for leadership. What kind of discussions do you have in and around that, or do you?
We do. We do. We absolutely have discussions around board succession. I should also say we do it the other way too. So
Okay.
we've done succession planning with senior leadership that may not be the ED or CEO. So to your point, like as it radiates out, right? We always recommend, if you're going to start with anything, start with your CEO or ED and then
Hmm.
move outward, right? It can
Okay.
be upward, it can be downward, but you want to move outward.
Hmm.
In terms of succession planning with the board, a lot of it is undertaken in a very similar way to the way we do it with staff, right? I'm a huge fan of scorecards. If you read Lean Recruitment, one of the epiphanies I had was, without boring you too much, we got into recruiting after years of me avoiding it because I figured there was some sort of like magic to it because
Hmm.
people were paying so much
They
for
do.
recruiters.
Yeah.
And so I challenged our team, could we cut it and make it half the time for half the cost? And make it research based. So we looked at over 100 articles. And one of the things that you find that is research based in recruitment that we often don't do is scorecarding, is figuring out what it is that you want ahead of time, putting weights and assigning numbers to it. And this is not it's a triage tool. It's an aid. It's not the decider, right? We're not like handing over to the computers to decide everything, but it becomes really incredibly helpful. And in succession planning, the way we use scorecards is we build it out for what we want the job to be.
Hmm.
So whether
Okay.
it's a board member or a CEO or COO or a director of development, you can suddenly score people against it.
Hmm. Okay.
So if it's a board member, potential board member, you could say, okay, how does Ginny score on what we said, when we were sober and really thinking about our organization versus we were intoxicated on this wonderful person that we're talking to, et cetera. We've all been there, right?
Yeah.
And you
Yep.
get that board member where everyone goes, oh my gosh, Jenny's the
This
best
is it.
thing,
This is
right?
it.
But then you score and you say, gosh, she's not really aligning with what we said we needed.
That's
Now,
really interesting. Now, I have not seen this method done. using a
Yeah, I mean,
scorecard per se. I need to read lean recruitment. That's what you're about to tell me, isn't it, Gary?
you can,
Get on it.
again, free on the website, or you can buy on Amazon. As I've said before, we've sold on every continent except Antarctica, which I'm working on. Um, but I'm a big fan of scorecards in a variety of ways because, again, you can also see how this can help you if you're the lone ED. Because in leadership legacy, we encourage you to not only look internally but externally
Mhm,
for people who could eventually fulfill your position or fill
mhm,
your position. But part of it is thinking about what are those scores with your board, right?
mhm.
And then scoring individuals and using that as a gap analysis, right? Like Ginny needs this, right? And typically there's three ways you develop anyone, internally or externally, right? It's training, it's challenge projects, it's
Mhm.
coaching,
Yeah.
right? And then thinking, what's the mix for that particular score so you can bring them to a point where when you do a hiring process, you can feel very confident. Again, similar thing with board members is how do they fit on our scorecard? Right. And again, it's not deciding for you. You could always make an exception and say, well, we like Ginny so much, let's break the scorecard or let's ignore it. But it becomes a way to dispassionately
Yeah.
assess who you have and what you may need in the future.
Yeah, and to really carefully understand what they have to offer, what your expectations will be, and to kind of marry those. So
That's right.
I like that a lot. That's great. Um, we talked a little bit about what there are, what keys there are to successful succession planning as far as some of the dynamics and considerations. But are there other really uh, uh, key pieces of information to keep in mind as you go through this process outside of your strategy of looking at it as risk reduction overall?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, um, the thing I always recommend if you're undertaking some large endeavor, right? And I'm a big fan of Covey's quadrants, and if you're not familiar with them, I won't go into them. But basically, one of the things Stephen Covey says is that there are certain things that are important, but if they're not urgent, you kind of never get to them, right? And I think succession planning is one of them. And
Yeah.
there are many things in your life as an ED or a CEO. What I always recommend is set aside a time. If it is 1 hour a month, if it is 1 hour a week, right? Set aside a time, block it, make it sacred, and start moving the ball slowly. So consider ways that, again, you can move this incrementally so that it isn't keeping you up at 3 a.m. when you realize you don't have it, but you're never going to find 100 hours to do it,
Yeah.
right? But instead, you can wake up at 3 a.m. and say, well, we're most of the way there, you know, because I've been chipping away at it. So I would think about those considerations. The other thing I would think about that people I think mostly don't consider, especially in smaller mid-sized nonprofits, is that, you know, we tend to have much leaner management structures, right? So that means few potential people to move their way up.
Hmm.
And, certainly and we can go into a whole conversation as to, is it better to have somebody inside or outside? There's a whole body of research that I've read around that as well over the years. But, at the end of the day, you should really have both. You shouldn't be
Yeah.
dependent on one person. And so, especially if you're a smaller, mid-sized nonprofit, letting yourself open up to talking to somebody outside the organization and saying, Jenny, I'm really interested in your career and eventually you having a position like mine, right? You don't want to make the commitment and say, eventually you will have my job because now you're in legal
Because
issues.
I'm the executive director who can do that
Exactly.
anyway.
Exactly. But you can't say things like, I think someday you should be an executive director. I'd love to help you get to a point where
Develop.
when I leave, you're a competitor,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Definitely.
And not just think inside, not just think outside, but think about both concurrently because that's the
Okay.
way you start getting a robust pipeline.
Okay. Yeah, it's interesting when you were talking about um, looking at it from but just take an hour, set it aside and do it. It really, and what it usually is for me when strategic planning is making succession planning a component of the strategic plan and something that they can focus on. But the way that you have it set up with risk reduction makes it even more fitting for that process in that it becomes a goal and you can set yearly goals, quarterly goals. As far I know you said it's not goal setting, but it really is a way to kind of build that ladder to get you to the ultimate place, for people who think that way, at least executive directors who like that kind of mindset.
I think that's absolutely right. And this brings up another consideration when you're working with a consultant is I would try to get the system, right? So
Mhm.
what I mean by that is, as I mentioned, one of the things that we do is what we call knowledge capture. It's a process we use for capturing important information about a given role. We regularly have clients who openly say, we want you to teach us as you do it, because then we can do all our senior management and we
Yeah,
don't need you to do it. They can
yeah,
start doing it. We can
that's
feel
smart.
even more confidence. So it is something to think about is not only can you self-execute the CEO ED position, but you should also think about how can we build our capacity so we can self-execute future positions? Because
Yeah,
ideally, right, like my spouse is in big pharma, you know. Um, but everyone has a succession plan. Every single person,
yeah,
whatever level you're at. And in the
yeah.
nonprofit world,
In the
we're glad
corporate,
if the CEO or ED does, right?
right? We're
And
lucky. We're lucky
exactly,
if they're
exactly. So it's one of those things where you may want to think about how do we build our capacity internally while we're paying this person, so that then we could do it ourselves and
just
reduce our
smart.
risk organization wide.
Well, and then you even think about the fact that retention in the nonprofit sector is such a problem. And so if you have this in place for your key positions, that it's not going to be as traumatic to the organization when you do have that turnover. That's somewhat inevitable just because of the nature of the work, compassion driven and all of that.
I mean, I think that's exactly right. And, Sherm had a great article, I think it was last week, the Society for Human Resource Managers,
Mhm.
which some of you may not know is like the association for human resources. And they're starting to talk about the turnover tsunami
Mhm.
that they're expecting. So similar to what we experienced in 2008 as we came out of the Great Recession, where a lot of people didn't want to move or took jobs because they need the money, right? And now they're moving.
Yep.
And, we're already getting kind of pulled into a number of conversations with executive directors who are saying, nobody knows yet,
Yep.
but I actually wanted to leave last year, but then this whole pandemic thing happened. So I think, this is especially a time where, as you said, this is always something that nonprofits should be particularly focused on because it eats up more resources than it should. But over the next 12 to 18 months, big issue,
Yeah.
big issue.
That's so interesting. I've been thinking this way and kind of predicting that. I hadn't seen that article from SHRM. I'm really interested to go check that out and see what their predictions are. I do. You see it. People don't want to go back from remote. They're leaving jobs that are going to require in person. There's a whole lot that's going to go into this, and we can make a whole nother show, Gary.
I know, right?
No doubt, all about retention and what it's going to happen and the impact of the pandemic and what nonprofit sector is going to look like now. Is there anything else you want to add about the succession planning, i.e., risk reduction planning for an organization?
I mean, what I would say is this. I would say, make the commitment today, right? If you're watching the video, make the commitment to yourself, right? And this is not like then call me up or call Janina and hire us, right? I'm just saying for the sake of your organization, make the commitment, commit to do something, commit to that hour a month, that hour a week, if you can do it. 1 hour a month, all of you should be able to do something and start working on these things, start reducing these risks now because they're not going away. They're never going to go away and it's going to be even worse over the next 12 to 18 months. So get going on it. If you do nothing else, just commit to do something about it.
Yeah, and for those who join me often on coffee conversations, they know that I'm action oriented, and I believe we have welcomed a guest who is also equally action oriented. So it has really been a pleasure, Gary.
It
I
has.
feel so honored that you spent this time with me today, and I look forward to sharing this with the nonprofit leadership in our world. So
Thank
thank
you for
you.
having me. It's been a pleasure.